Dear students, we are going to deal with the topic, the Indo-European family of languages. One might be wondering as to the relevance of the epithet Indo in the context of the Indo-European family of languages. This is because of the relatedness of the Indian language represented by Sanskrit with the European languages. The European languages are best represented by Latin, Greek and Germanic, and the Germanic representation of the European language is English. Therefore, when we compare some Sanskrit words with Latin, Greek and Germanic in the form of English words, we find a stunning similarity. And this accounts for the inclusion of the epithet Indo in the context of Indo-European family of languages. There are more than 6,000 languages spoken in the world. Not all these languages have got the written form of expression. Only a few hundreds of languages have got the written form of expression. The Indo-European family of languages refer to the languages which have got similarity in sound pattern and also in the structure of vocabulary, which mean one and the same thing. Once upon a time, that is during the prehistoric times, people in the European continent were concentrated in a particular place. And these people were nomadic in nature. They did not stick to a particular place of existence. They started moving about here and there, migrated from one place to another place for the sake of seeking new pastures. When they did so, a group of such people came to the northern part of India. And one must remember that before disintegration, this European community was speaking a language which later linguists call the Indo-European language. When that language was spoken, it was not called Indo-European, because what kind of language or what name did it possess, we do not know, because prehistory doesn't provide us with any such information. A chunk of this European community speaking one and the same language came to the northern part of India in the days of yore. They came and settled down in the northern part of India up to the border of present Maharashtra. By the time they came, the languages that prevailed in the northern part of India happened to be Pali and Prakrit. And this European language which was taken by this European community to the northern part of India was implanted here, installed and then developed here, and this ultimately resulted in the origin of the Sanskrit language. The various languages that are contained in the Indo-European family are Indian, represented by Sanskrit, Iranian, Armenian, Albanian, Balto-Slavic, Italic, Hellenic, Celtic and Germanic. These are the various languages that come under the Indo-European family group. As has been stated earlier, a chunk of the European community came to the northern part of India, and after instituting the Sanskrit language, they once again started migrating to the Iranian part. It was formerly called the Old Persian region. And in the Old Persian region, there was already a chunk of the European community settled, and they became Persians. And this Sanskrit-speaking European community crossed the northwestern frontier and reached the old Persian part and started mixing with the Persian population. Not only the races mixed, but also their languages. Sanskrit started exerting a tremendous influence on the old Persian language and Zend, which were the languages of the old Persian population. As a result, these languages of Persia started assimilating the essential characteristics of Sanskrit, and the mixed population and also the mixed languages were transported by the migrant population again to the southern parts of Russia and to the southern parts of China. And some historically important thing had happened, about which we shall see later. And now we come to the next group of language, our next language, namely Armenian. Armenia is a small country that lies between the Caucasus Mountains and the eastern part of the Black Sea. In Armenia, there prevailed a language which laterly came to be known as Armenian. And it is a matter of interest to know that Armenian happened to be one of the languages in which the biblical scriptures were written. But the world came to know of the existence of the Armenian language only during the 5th century AD. Until then, the world did not have any knowledge about the existence of the Armenian language. That is, when the biblical scriptures were began to be written, Armenian happened to be one of the languages which was used in the writing of the scriptures. And this Armenian language can be stated to have originated from the 5th century AD onwards. And interestingly, this Armenian language still remains at the spoken level. So the written form of expression is there for official purposes. We do not find much of its literature existing. It is still to be developed as a language of literature. And in this regard, we have to distinguish between a language and a dialect. What is a dialect? A dialect is the regional variation of any language. It is mostly in the spoken form. It is called a dialect. A dialect cannot be properly represented in the written form. But a language is something different. A language is a full-fledged linguistic unit which is developed in its phonology, vocabulary, literature, and grammatical aspects. So, considered from this point of view, we find that Armenian remains a dialect, even though it is called a language. It is a language in the sense that it is officially used in the written form, but from the point of view of literariness, we find that it is not a language of literary value. The next language in the Indo-European family is the Albanian language. Albania is a small country that lies near the Adriatic Sea, near Greece. And this Albanian language also is of some interesting value because it is also one of the languages in which the biblical scriptures were written. Like the Armenian language, this Albanian also can be traced of its origin to the 5th century. Albanian also happened to be one of the languages in which the biblical scriptures were written. But when compared to Armenian, we find that Albanian is much developed because we find the existence of literature there. So, it is a language that has got its importance from the standpoint of both speech and written form of expressions. We find the development of its literature right from the 18th century AD onwards, and it has got two variations, North Albanian and South Albanian. North Albanian is called Tosk and South Albanian is called Geg. So these two variations are there, in the Albanian language. The next is the Balto-Slavic group of languages, Indo-European family. Baltic plus Slavic lead to the term Balto-Slavic. Baltic languages are those languages that prevail in the area abutting the Baltic Sea, and Slavic languages pertain to the Czechoslovakian, Yugoslavian, Russian region. Prussian, Lettic and Lithuanian, to quote a few, are some of the languages that belong to the Baltic group. The Slavic languages are Russian, Polish, Wend, and then Czechoslovakian, Romanian, Serbian, Croatian, etc., to quote a few. So it is a matter of interest to note that the Lettic language, which prevails in the Latvian region, has got its connectedness and close relatedness with the Sanskrit language. While dealing with the migration of the Sanskrit-speaking North Indian community, which got mixed up with the old Persian population, which eventually started migrating to the central parts of China and southern parts of Russia, we find that this settlement came to rest in a place which came to be known as Latvia. So when this mixed population settled down in the Latvian region, the essential features of the Sanskrit language started mingling with the Lettic language or the Latvian language. As a result, the Lettic language assumed the essential characteristics of the Sanskrit language. So, when you speak in pure Latvian to a man who knows Sanskrit, he will be able to understand it. And when pure Sanskrit is spoken, a man who knows Latvian will be able to understand the contents. So, such is the kind of tremendous influence we find taking place in the Lettic language or the Latvian language because of the influence of the Sanskrit speaking mixed Persian population which started settling down in the southern parts of Russia. So the next language in the Indo-European family is the Italic. When we speak of Italy or when we think of Italy, we are reminded of so many things because Italy happened to be the high seat of Christianity. It was the high seat of Catholicism. That is, it was a high seat of papacy and all that. So when we think of Italy, we think of Rome. When we think of Italy, we think of Christianity. Then we think of the Latin language. So chain-like, these thoughts come to our mind. The language normally does not die. A language dies only when all the people speaking that language die en masse. So, when we deal with the Italic group of languages, we find that very many languages existed in the region. That is, very many communities, very many tribes from the European parts coexisted there speaking different languages. Of these, Latin became important, or it assumed significance because the people speaking the Latin language happened to be very, very dominant, not only physically but also mentally and also militarily. So in the Italic region, there existed many languages. For example, Messapian, Oscan, Venetic, Umbrian and Latin happen to be the languages spoken by different tribes. Of all these languages, Latin became dominant because the Romans who were speaking this Latin language were very dominant in all sense. So, this Latin-speaking Roman population started subjugating and sublimating with their authority the other tribes speaking other languages in the area. As a result, all the other tribes speaking all other languages started waning from that area. They disappeared from the societal scene, or they merged with the Roman population to the oblivion of their own language in the long run. As a result, Latin became a dominant language in that area from which a modern Italian had sprung. And this Latin ultimately got itself divided into two divisions, namely Vulgar Latin and Classical Latin. What is this Vulgar Latin? The English word vulgar comes from the Latin word vulgus, which means common. When you say vulgar Latin or vulgar language, you say what we mean is common man's language. The common man's language which is used for day-to-day existence, day-to-day conversation, day-to-day talk and all that. So there were two variations of the Latin language. One happened to be the vulgar Latin variation and another classical Latin. And this classical Latin language is a refined language, a chiseled language, which was popularized by means of Latin literature during the 2nd century BC. And the next language that comes for consideration is the Hellenic group of languages in the Indo-European context. When we think of the Hellenic group, we think of the Helen of Troy. When we think of the Helen of Troy, we are reminded of Greece. So this modern Greece was known as the Hellenic world in the days of ancients. It was also called the Phrygian world. It was also called the Aegean world. Like the Italic world, in this Hellenic world also there existed many tribes speaking so many languages. Of these, Greek became a very dominant language, even though initially this Greek was not known as Greek. So in the Hellenic world, there existed many languages spoken by so many tribes, and all these tribes had come from one and the same part of some area of Europe. Which area we do not know for certain, because prehistory doesn't provide us with any information as to this aspect. So in the Hellenic area, so many people were living, speaking so many languages. And to quote a few languages, I should say that there existed Doric, Attic, Arcadian, Cyprian, and so on. Of these languages, Attic became very dominant. Attic means Greek. Attic is a term very much used by the Romantic poet John Keats. When you say Attic, it means Greek. So this Attic-speaking population became dominant in the Hellenic area. As a result, the other language groups became insignificant, or they felt subjugated or sublimated to the authority of the Attic population and disappeared from the societal scene, or whoever dared to coexist along with the Attic-speaking population merged with the population and lost their identity in the long run. So thus, the Attic language became a dominant linguistic factor in that region, in that Hellenic region, which laterly became Greece. So this Attic language, on par with Latin, diverged into two divisions, namely Demotic Greek and Classical Greek. Demotic Greek means democratic Greek, that is vulgar Greek, that is common man's Greek, that is the Greek variation used by every citizen in that area for day-to-day conversation. But when you say Classical Greek, it means literary Greek, which was popularized during the 2nd century AD, 2nd century BC, I mean. One striking feature is that Sanskrit, Latin and Greek more or less developed during the same time span. Sanskrit had its grammatical development during the 2nd century BC. The Latin and the Greek languages had their literary development and other developments during the 2nd century BC. So how did it happen, we do not know. But one thing is certain, that these languages have got some connectedness, some relatedness and all that. So the next group in the Indo-European family that needs to be considered is the Celtic language. And what is the striking feature of this Celtic language? The striking feature of this Celtic language is that it is the original language of Britain. It is not the English language of Britain. So the English language has got no connectedness or relatedness with Britain. The original language of Britain is the Celtic language, because Celtic happened to be the language of the first civilized and cultured inhabitants of that land, which laterly became Britain. In fact, Britain was populated by a group of people during the Stone Age. They were known as the cavemen or the beaker people, but they assume no significance at all in the history of Britain, because by the time they were occupying Britain or they were existing in Britain, Britain did not possess that name. What name did it possess, we do not know. History is very silent about it because it all belongs to prehistory. Laterly, people from three directions from the European continent came to live in that island nation which laterly became Britain. When they came, it was not known as Britain. People from Iberia, that is today's Spain, people from the far eastern part of Europe that can be identified today with the western Russian part, and then people from the Gallic region to be identified with France, today's France. So people from these three directions came to barge into this land which laterly became Britain, and they conglomerated there, they mixed, and they became one population. They called themselves Celts because they were all using a stone instrument for all purposes, that is for fighting with the enemy, for tilling the land, for doing any kind of work. They used this Celt instrument. As a result, they were called, or they called themselves Celts. And particularly the people who came from Iberia, called the Iberians, called themselves or started calling themselves Brittonic Celts. Why did they want to call themselves Brittonic Celts, we do not know. So from this name Briton came the name of the country Britain, and the Celtic language of these first civilized and cultured inhabitants happened to be the first civilized language of Britain, and English doesn't have any kind of historical significance in calling itself the language of Britain. So the Celtic language happened to be the first language, first cultured language or civilized language of the settlers of the country called Britain. And this Celtic language suffered a setback because of the invasion of the Germanic tribes in Britain. When the Romans occupying Britain vacated the country because of some sudden domestic compulsions, these Brittonic Celts were left in the lurch. These Brittonic Celts were helped by the Romans in all ways. Therefore, the Romans were considered to be their godfathers. When these godfathers left the country, all on a sudden, there was a vacuum in the country. The country happened to be very great, very vast, and then the Brittonic Celts were meager in number. They were not numerically sufficient to guard this land. As a result, the country became vulnerable for external attack, and the situation was capitalized by the Germanic tribes called the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They barged into this island nation, much to the discomfort and inconvenience of the already existing Brittonic Celts. As a result of this surge of these Germanic tribes, the Brittonic Celts living in Britain disintegrated to various corners of Britain and disappeared from the societal scene, and a fragmentary percentage of the Celtic population, which was prepared to coexist with the Anglo-Saxon Jutic tribes, lost their identity because of their intermarriage and other social integration with the invading community. So this Celtic language spoken by these Brittonic Celts was taken to different corners of Britain and then installed. As a result, this Celtic language became diverged or diversified and resulted in the birth of many other languages, namely Cornish, Welsh, Irish, Scottish, Breton, and Manx. So Celtic is the mother of many languages which prevail in Britain today, spoken by a number of the British population, and they cannot be called the English population. So this is all about the Celtic language. The original language of the British nation, namely the Celtic, diverged into various languages and still are spoken by so many people in the Wales, Cornwall, Scottish and Irish regions. The last in the Indo-European family is the Germanic language, and this Germanic can further be subdivided into East Germanic, North Germanic and West Germanic. That is, The primitive Germanic language was taken by the migrant Germanic tribal population to different corners, and eventually this resulted in the branching of this primitive Germanic, resulting in East Germanic, North Germanic and West Germanic. Under the East Germanic, we find Burgundian, Vandal and Gothic languages. And North Germanic, we find the Scandinavian languages. Here, I want to take a digression and then provide you with some information about the Scandinavian region. Why is it called Scandinavia? Scandinavia was a region nameless in the days of the ancients, and the Germanic tribes learned that there was plenteously available a metal in that region called scandium, and they started to go there by means of navigation on the high seas. So the region abounding in a metal called scandium plus the method of transportation to that area by means of navigation combined, and the region came to be known as the Scandinavian region. So scandium metal plus navigation, scandium plus navigation resulted in the name for that region, namely Scandinavia. So to this region the Germans flocked. They went there, diverged once again and settled in different parts, and ultimately the Scandinavian region became a geographical structure containing many countries, namely Norway, Sweden, Denmark and Finland. Depending upon localization, the primitive Germanic language taken by these Germans to the Scandinavian area resulted in the origin and development of Norwegian, Danish, Swedish and Finnish languages. So these Scandinavian languages are classified under the North Germanic languages. And we come to the West Germanic segment of the Germanic language. So under West Germanic we find Old High German, Old Saxon, Old Low Franconian and Anglo-Frisian. Old High German gave place to High German, Old Saxon gave place to Low Saxon, Old Low Franconian gave place to Dutch and Flemish, and Anglo-Frisian gave place to the development of Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon gave place to the Middle English, and Middle English gave place to Modern English. So when we think of Modern English, we immediately think of Middle English. When we think of Middle English, we think of Old English, which is otherwise called Anglo-Saxon. And when we think of Anglo-Saxon, we think of Anglo-Frisian. And when we think of Anglo-Frisian, we think of the West Germanic variation of the Germanic language. And when we think of the Germanic language, we think of the Indo-European family. So from these informations, it is very clear that English is an Indo-European language primarily, and more specifically it is a Germanic language. So this Modern English emanated or developed from Middle English, and Middle English developed from Anglo-Saxon, otherwise known as Old English. So in this regard, a little bit of information on Old English is necessary. When the language started developing in England because of its transportation from the Germanic region, it remained only at the dialectical level. That is, the vocabulary was dismal, there was no phonological variation. The vocabulary of this Anglo-Saxon or Old English was very, very dismal once again, and then the grammatical aspect was illogical and there was no literature at all. So it remained only at the dialectical level. So this English language started developing very, very slowly but very, very surely, because the Old English population, namely the Germanic tribes, namely the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, who came to Britain, started settling down there, and out of one of their names, namely the Angles, the language got its name English. Angles, initially it was called the Angles language, and afterwards it became Engels language, and still afterwards it became the English language. And the land became their property, therefore it was called Angles land. Laterly it became Anglo land and then England. So the language was called the English language, and the nation was called the Angles nation. Afterwards it was called the English nation. Afterwards it was called the Angles land, and then Anglo land, and then England. This is how the name English and England were begot. So initially, when this Germanic population came to the country, the language was at the dialectical level without any significant improvement in any aspect, namely phonology, vocabulary, grammar, and literature. So this went on for about 4 centuries. So it all, when the Anglo-Saxon population felt that their vocabulary was not sufficient, they started assimilating words from other Germanic languages, particularly whenever they happened to go to their own home country, or whenever their friends or their relatives happened to visit them in England. So there was a slow intake or assimilation of words from various other Germanic languages, namely Primitive Germanic, Old High German, and then Gothic. As a result, the fractured state of vocabulary of the Anglo-Saxon language was developed by means of assimilation. Afterwards, around the 6th century AD, there was a Roman invasion in England. As a result of this Roman invasion, the Latin language started exerting its excellent influence on the English language, otherwise known as the Anglo-Saxon language or Old English language, because it is called Old English because it has no relatedness with modern English, even though modern English developed from Old English. So this Old English language was highly fractured, as has been already stated. So the Latin language masters found the fractured state of the Anglo-Saxon language and started providing it with enough requirements of linguistic needs, and after that supply from the Latin language, the Anglo-Saxon language started developing very slowly, surely, particularly in vocabulary and also in the grammatical system. When these two aspects developed, ultimately literature became a possibility by means of translation of religious scriptures from the Latin language into Anglo-Saxon. So our dealing with the Indo-European family comes to a close, and to sum up, I have to say that this Indo-European family is one of the families of languages in the world. All the languages in the world are classified under different families, namely Sino-Tibetan, Indo-European, Dravidian, Afro-Asiatic, Malayo-Polynesian, Niger-Congo, Nishada, and Kosian dialects. But the Indo-European family assumes significance because the English language is an Indo-European language. Therefore, the Indo-European family assumes significance when we study the English language with its literature. And in the context of the Indo-European family, we find that it is variated into Indian, Iranian, Armenian, Albanian, Balto-Slavic, Italic, Hellenic, Celtic, and Germanic divisions. And we have already seen what this Indian division is and what this Iranian division is, how various factors contributed to the various influences that each language had in its developmental form, in its developmental stage. And finally, when we deal with the Germanic language, we come to know that the Germanic tribes were responsible for the constitution of the English language by transporting their own Germanic dialects to the country called Britain, and they instituted their dialects there. They started combining these dialects into a whole, and then this single whole was spoken in different forms in different regions of Britain, and ultimately all came to be relieved of their uncertainties and illogicalities and even inconsistencies, and everything was standardized by the end of the 14th century, that is around 1500, and as a result we have got the modern English in the form in which we have got. Thank you.